Welcome back to Fine Tooning with Drew Taylor, your one-stop shop when it comes to animation news and commentary. I'm entertainment writer Jim Hill, and Mr. Taylor, whose writings on the industry you can regularly read over on The Wrap, and whose musings on the Mission Impossible movies you can listen to on the Light the Fuse podcast. I think he's flying back to LA today. And when I say today, I mean Sunday, October 6th, which is when I'm recording this week's episode. Anyway, Mr. Taylor will be back in the saddle here in time for next week's show, Fine Tooning. That said, Drew and I were in touch earlier this week when news broke about the possible sale of the Chaplin lot out in Florida. And just so you know, folks, the Jim Henson Company is now saying that's not a thing. They actually issued an official statement yesterday, Saturday, October 5th, saying that, and I quote, this comes straight from the Wrap, by the way, in regards to recent rumors about the sale of the La Brea studio lot, the Henson Company is not in any business dealings with the Church of Scientology, and that organization is not in consideration as a potential buyer of the property. It is still the family's intention to move the Jim Henson Company to a new location it can then share with Jim Henson's Creature Shop, but at this time, the family is not in escrow with any buyer. And again, want to stress, this info comes straight from The Wrap, which posted a piece disputing this rumor yesterday afternoon. Just putting this out there, since we're now discussing Muppet-related rumors, it would be great if the Walt Disney Company would issue a similar sort of statement clarifying where exactly the Monsters, Inc. door coaster is supposed to be built at Disney's Hollywood Studios, because, I gotta tell you, rumors continue to swirl about how that project will potentially negatively impact MuppetVision 3D. And speaking of having a negative impact, just be happy, folks, that you're not the executive at Warner Brothers Discovery who greenlit production of that Joker sequel that opened in theaters this past Friday. Holy cow. Are you folks seeing the same box office numbers that I've been seeing? Industry insiders are now saying that given the poisonous word of mouth that now surrounds Joker, Folie et Deux, high school French, which I just want to remind you was a sequel to a film that took home 2 Academy Awards back in 2019. Also racked up over $1 billion worth of ticket sales worldwide. And how times have changed. If the current box office trends hold, there is just no way that this studio is ever going to recover the $190 million that Warner Bros. Discovery spent on this Todd Phillips film. But the upside is DreamWorks Animation's The Wild Robot had a solid second weekend at the domestic box office. It actually came in number 2 behind that Joker sequel. North American ticket sales for this Chris Sanders movie currently sit at $63.9 million. In the number 4 spot is Transformers 1. That Paramount Pictures release is still out in 3,100 theaters in North America, and its box office, domestic box office, currently sits at $47 million. I'm not going to lie here. It kind of makes me sad that so few animation fans have gone out of their way to see this Josh Cooley movie while it's in theaters. And look, Transformers 1 will undoubtedly finally find an audience when it starts running on, well, the HBOs of the world or cable, but folks, this isn't an animated film you really want to see up on a big screen. All right, so that's our box office-related news for this week. And we'll have more animation-related news in a moment, but before we get to that part of the podcast, I want to remind you that the news portion of Fine Tooning is brought to you by TouringPlans.com. And if you're headed down to Central Florida anytime soon to sample some of the theme parks that can be found around the city beautiful, well, Touring Plans can help you save time. More importantly, it can help you save money as you wander around Walt Disney World or the Universal Orlando Resort. So please check them out at TouringPlans.com. Okay, so we were just talking about how Joker, Folie et Deux, I hope I'm saying that right, isn't doing nearly as well at the box office as the executive at Warner Brothers Discovery had hoped this Todd Phillips film would do, which isn't necessarily saying that they're going to stop making DC Comics-related movies anytime soon. Case in point, the Dynamic Duo project, which just got announced this past week, which will be a collaboration between DC Studios and Warner Brothers Pictures Animation. Now, what's especially interesting about this project, which will focus on the early days of Dick Grayson and Jason Todd, a.k.a. the Robins, well, it's supposed to be done using puppetry animation. More to the point, this film will actually be made by Swaybox, which is this brand new animation studio that's based out of New Orleans. And what's genuinely intriguing about Swaybox is, well, they specialize in a type of animation called Momo animation, which is basically a cross between CG, stop motion, and real-time performance capture, which I've heard really lends itself to creating a distinctive-looking superhero movie. And let's face it, folks, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse and its sequel Across the Spider-Verse are now considered the gold standard when it comes to that sort of animated film. And I have to applaud Warner Brothers Pictures Animation and DC Studios for taking this sort of chance on Swaybox, seeing if they can then turn a Dynamic Duo into something truly special, like, say, Into the Spider-Verse. That said, given that Warner Bros. Discovery is the studio that recently made two animated films, Scoob! Haunted Holiday and Coyote vs. Acme, that it eventually opted not to send out into theaters. In fact, it killed both of those projects strictly for tax purposes. Well, here's hoping that Dynamic Duo, once the folks at Swaybox complete making this thing, actually manages to make it out into theaters, lives to see the light of day. Because, you never know what's actually going to connect with an audience, at least when it comes to animation. By that, I mean, back in the early 1990s, I was on the phone with a friend who'd just been hired to work on a brand new animated series for Nickelodeon. And when he told me the name of that show, well, I actually had him repeated a couple of times because I was like, because the words sounded, well, there's a line out of a comedy song from the 40s called Mersey Notes, where if the words sound queer or funny to your ear, a little bit jumbled and jivey. And I say that as a guy who actually went to a press event for that short-lived Disney television animation show, the Super Robot Monkey Team Hyperforce Go. Anyway, on this phone call, I made my friend Justin say this show's name a couple of times in a row because it just made no sense to me. SpongeBob SquarePants? Now, jump ahead 25 years, and SpongeBob is a full-fledged franchise. And to celebrate this cartoon character, which has been now around for a quarter of a century, well, Wendy's, the fast food chain, starting on the day this podcast goes live online, which should be Tuesday, October 8th, they're going to start offering, mind you, for a limited time, Krabby Patties. Not only that, but Wendy's, again, also as part of this year's celebration of SpongeBob's 25th anniversary, will be offering a Pineapple Under the Sea Frosty, which will be a vanilla Frosty with a pineapple mango flavored puree swirl. The first of its kind Frosty. This fast food chain is actually using the phrase innovation. And just in case you're wondering, yes, I will be there at my local Wendy's on Tuesday, October 8th to sample the Krabby Patty, which I'm hoping will be just as good as the Krusty Burger that Universal now sells at Fast Food Boulevard, at Universal Studios Florida, and I want to say also in Simpsons Land at Universal Studios Hollywood. And since we're talking about old animated series from Nickelodeon, did you see where Paramount Pictures just announced that they're planning on making a new Rugrats movie? Only this time around, well, the gimmick for this Jason Moore movie will be that while the adults will be portrayed by live actors. The babies, Chucky, Tommy, Phil, and Lil, will be done using CG. Just makes me wonder, Angelica's a little older. I wonder how they're going to handle her, if she's going to be CG or live actors. Oh, by the way, doubling back to dynamic duo just for a sec here. Paramount, just like Warner Brothers, seems to be looking for ways to make their animated films stand out from the crowd. So, again, CG babies in a Rugrats movie. Let's see what happens. And you know who else used to stand out from a crowd? Ken Page. I was lucky enough back in, this would have been the late 1970s, to see him on stage in the original Broadway production of that Tony Award-winning musical, Ain't Misbehaving, where Ken did an amazing job of portraying Fats Waller. And in fact, it was supposedly Page's performance in Ain't Misbehaving that reportedly led to him being cast as the voice of Oogie Boogie in Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas, though in that instance, Ken was really doing more of a combination of Fats Waller and Cab Calloway. Anyway, we lost Ken Page earlier this week on Monday, September 30th, to be exact. He was 70 years old, and as recently as last year, at that 30th anniversary celebration of Nightmare Before Christmas that was staged at the Hollywood Bowl, Mr. Page was up there on stage, delighting the nearly 18,000 people who were in attendance at that concert as he sang the Oogie Boogie song. And the composer of that tune, Danny Elfman, when he learned of Ken's passing, hopped on X this past Tuesday to say, "I'm still stunned by last night's terrible news. Ken Page died suddenly. He was the one and only Oogie Boogie man. He was simply the best, most generous soul I know, full of life and overflowing with joy, talented and then some. Ken, my friend, you will be deeply missed." And of course, when I think of Tim Burton's Nightmare Before Christmas, well, I think of stop motion animation and Halloween. And speaking of those two topics, did you see where, on the heels of Coraline being released to theaters this past summer and selling some $53 million worth of tickets in North America, that Leica, in partnership with Fathom, is bringing this beloved stop-motion movie back to theaters this year for a special Halloween engagement that begins on October 31st. Now, what will make Coraline's return to theaters later this month special, a must-see for animation fans, is that as part of this 15th anniversary screening, ticket buyers will get an early glimpse at Leica's next full-length animated feature, Wildwood, which isn't due in theaters till next year, 2025. Let's see. Beyond that, speaking of films that did well over the summer of 2024, Inside Out, which as of right now is still the top grossing movie for the whole year, with worldwide ticket sales of $1.69 billion, just made an impressive debut over on Disney+. Over the first 5 days that this Kelsey Mann movie was available for viewing on that subscription streaming service that started on September 25th, it was viewed more than 30.5 million times. Those are just crazy, crazy numbers to me. Anyway, when we get back from this break, as a follow-up to last week's feature where we talked about that plaque honoring Mickey Mouse that used to be on display in the lobby of the Broadway Theater in New York City, we're now going to talk about another commemorative plaque, one that's supposed to go up shortly in Miami and will then honor one of Walt Disney's, inspirations and eventually direct competitors, which is animation pioneer and innovator Max Fleischer. But first, this. And we're back. Okay. Like I said, on the heels of last week's story about that plaque in the lobby of the Broadway Theater, a Fine Tooning listener, to be honest, they reached out a few weeks ago to see if we'd heard about the effort that's currently underway down in Miami to commemorate the site of the Fleischer Studios in Florida. Now, back in 1938, Max and Dave Fleischer, the talented brothers behind the Betty Boop cartoons and the Popeye shorts, they moved their operation from NYC. And by the way, their animation studio operated out of an office building just off of Times Square, 1600 Broadway to be exact, which, if you know this part of town, is where, well, at ground level anyway, is where the M&M New York store is located. So given how those characters turn up in so many ads these days as animated, it's kind of appropriate. Anyway, starting back in November of 1923, Max Fleischer Productions made their home in this Manhattan office building. And just so you know, 1600 Broadway was also where Paramount Pictures corporate headquarters was located in the 1920s and the 1930s, which, given that Paramount also released the animated output of Fleischer Studios, it kind of makes sense. And over the next 15 years, Fleischer Studios went from occupying a single floor in this 26-story tall structure. By the way, they started on the 6th floor. They eventually expanded to 4 full floors of the building, with some 500 artists and animators working on the studio's animated short, as well as Fleischer's first full-length animated features, Gulliver's Travels, which, by the way, would eventually be released to theaters in December of 1939, some 2 years after Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Now, where this gets interesting is that Max had been trying to get a full-length animated feature in the works for years. He had been talking up this idea to his bosses at Paramount Studios since the early 1930s, long before Walt began noodling on the idea of making Snow White. But because, well, on the heels of the stock market crash of 1929, Paramount went through some very tight financial times. I want to say at least 2 different sets of managements, and never mind the expense of switching over to sound production. So in the early 1930s, they continually said no to Max Fleischer when it came to doing a feature, until, of course, Disney's Snow White came out in December of 1937 and then made a bundle. Whereupon Paramount executives were then, they were like, okay, we now agree to give you the money to make a full-length animated feature. That said, you're only going to get half the money Walt Disney spent on making Snow White. Oh, and by the way, we're going to expect a finished film in half the time that Disney spent making Snow White. Further complicating this whole situation was the fact that starting on May 7th of that same year, 1937, the artists and the animators at Fleischer Studio went on strike. And just to be clear here, this is a full 4 years before the strike that Disney Studios, if you talk to people who worked at it during that time, it was never the same after the strike in 41. But it was, that said, it was what happened at Fleischer was the same thing that happened at Disney. These are people who wanted better working conditions and higher pay. Now, where the Disney strike in 41 lasted 5 weeks, the Fleischer strike in 1937, it lasted 5 months. And after just 1 month of people picketing outside at 1600 Broadway, Max had had enough. He then quietly reached out to the Miami Chamber of Commerce, and this was because Max at that time had a winter residence down in Florida. And he began talking with the Chamber of Commerce there about possibly moving Fleischer Studios down to Florida. And let's be honest here, some of this was because land was cheap down there, but a lot of this had to do with the fact that the state of Florida was notorious for its anti-union bias. Anyway, Miami was almost immediately on board with the idea of Max moving his operation down to Florida, as were the executives in charge of Paramount Pictures, who not only agreed to loan the Fleischers the money to make this move, and by that I mean to pay their staffers to pack things up and move on down to Florida because they needed these same artists to continue to make the Betty Boop and the Popeye shorts and finish Gulliver's Travel. But they also, Paramount gave the Fleischers the $300,000 necessary to build this new state-of-the-art facility, which Max designed himself, by the way. And just to be clear here, the first ever state-of-the-art facility built from the ground up just for the production of animation wasn't built out in Burbank by Walt Disney in 1940, but rather it was built in Florida some 2 years earlier by Max Fleischer. So again, remember, innovator. By the way, if you'd like to see what this studio was like, head on over to YouTube and then type in, as your search terms, Popular Mechanics Fleischer Studios, and then you'll then be treated to an 8-minute long featurette that went out under the Popular Mechanics banner that takes you through this just-built animation studios in the summer of 1938 as the artists and animators at Fleischer are working on a two-reel Popeye cartoon, Aladdin and His Wonderful Lamp. And again, just it's the building. You could practically smell the new paint on the walls as you're watching this thing. I mean, it's that shiny and new. Anyway, it would be nice to report that Fleischer's move to Florida had a happy ending. But that's not what happened. I mean, for a time, things did go well down there. For example, Gulliver's Travels, when it was finally released to theaters, again, in December of 1939, did well enough at the box office. It was actually a top 10 grosser for that year that Paramount immediately agreed to underwrite the production of a second full-length animated feature, which these days is known by a couple of different names. There's Mr. Bug Goes to Town or Hoppity Goes to Town. This film, I guess the only way to describe it is it's basically an animated Frank Capra film. Anyway, Hoppity Goes to Town, which has some lovely animation in it. If you're an animation historian, do check it out. It's also worth noting because it had the worst release date in Hollywood history. Paramount originally planned on sending this full-length animated feature out into theaters on December 7th, 1941, which is, of course, the very same day the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And the very next day, America declares war on the Axis powers and officially enters World War II. And during this time, well, the movies that Hollywood made now obviously couldn't play in theaters over in Europe and Asia, which meant that 2/3 of the entertainment industry's regular revenue stream had suddenly been choked off, which suddenly made it so much harder for motion pictures, especially the ones that were particularly expensive to make, like, say, full-length animated features like Gulliver's Travels and Hoppity Goes to Town, made it hard for these films to turn a profit. Now, mind you, Walt Disney had to deal with this exact same issue during World War II, which is one of the reasons that Walt quickly agreed to start making training films to the Department of Defense, with the idea here being that he would do whatever it took to keep the lights on at his animation studio, to keep his staffers employed, those who hadn't been drafted, mind you. Whereas at Fleischer Studio, look, I'm not going to lie. The outbreak of World War II could not have come at a worse time. The two brothers who ran the whole operation down in Florida, Max, who, again, was the innovator, but largely ran the production side of things, whereas Dave, Max's brother, he directed the bulk of the output, for Fleischer Studios. These two guys were feuding. And it got so bad by the fall of 1941 that the Fleischers weren't even talking to one another. The only way they communicated was through memos. And this, to the executives at Paramount, was an untenable situation. It had to be resolved. So, in order to get things under control at Fleischer's, the first thing they did is they called all of the loans, the money that they'd lent them to build the studios, to finance the move of all the artists down there. And again, at this point, there's 760 people who work for this animation studios in Florida. And here's the thing, Max couldn't repay the loans. So in early 1942, Paramount effectively fires the Fleischers and then takes control of their animation studio, which later that same year gets its name changed to Famous Studios. And then to make sure that they could then keep all of these flaky, strike-prone artists and animators under control, Paramount executives decide to move the entire operation back up to New York City, where for the next 25 years, Famous Studios operated out of a pair of office buildings in Manhattan on West 45th Street. And as for the Fleischer Animation Studios in Florida, which, by the way, stands today at 701 Northwest 30th Avenue in Miami, it stood empty for a few years until the city eventually turned it into a family planning and youth center, and then for a time it was a police substation for the city. But for animation fans, the 4 years that Fleischer operated in Florida are worth remembering, which is why over the past couple of years, they've been pushing local officials to, well, at the very least, put up an official historical marker just outside of this still standing structure. And last I heard, County Commissioner Miguel A. Gabella is taking this request by the local community very, very seriously. There was reportedly a meeting back in August of this year where the historical marker for Fleischer's Florida studio was taken under advisement and was then supposed to come up for public review, which is why I want to ask Fine Tooning listeners who live in and around Miami, have you heard anything lately about this effort? Has an official decision been made yet? Because I was hearing on Google earlier today as I was working on this week's feature, and to my knowledge, nothing has officially been announced. Not yet, anyway. Now, mind you, Nancy's taking a cruise out of Miami next month, and if they're finally going to erect this historical marker in that same window of time, I may just tag along, make a special trip down to Florida, and finally get to see Fleischer Studios for myself, which, by the way, want to stress here, is not open to the public. And also need to remember that because this place was transformed into a police substation serving the greater Miami area prior to its closure, I don't know how much of the remaining structure would reflect that this building, which once upon a time was the largest air-conditioned building in all of Florida, that it used to be an animation studio. And that said, there has always been this joke that people at Disney, especially back in the 40s and 50s, used to make about the Fleischer Studio in Florida, how Max must have accidentally built this place on top of an old stop on the Underground Railway, to be, given the number of artists and animators that were trained by Fleischer in Florida that then eventually wound up working for Disney. It was like, well, these people would walk through the front door at that animation studios in Miami and then somehow magically wind up on Walt Disney payroll in Burbank. So, like I said, Underground Railroad connect from Miami to Burbank. Would love to see this place in person someday, and we'll see if that happens. And speaking of things that I love, Lately, I have been really enjoying digging through the back catalog of all those shows that Drew Taylor and Charles Hood have recorded for Light the Fuse, which is, of course, the official Mission Impossible podcast. I've honestly learned so much Hollywood history by listening to the show, and you can too, so check it out. And speaking of things you might enjoy, we do have a number of other podcasts here on the Jim Hill Media Podcast Network. We, of course, have the Mothership, Disney Dish, which I do with Len Testa. We also have the Epic Universal Podcast, which I do with Eric Hersey, who is the talented gentleman who produces a lot of the shows here at Jim Hill Media. And by the way, that show is now being published on a weekly basis. And speaking of shows that have just started being published on a weekly basis, there is also I Want That Too, the merch podcast that Lauren Hersey, who is Eric's lovely bride, and I do. And just this morning, I was conferring with Brian Gahn, and he and I are going to be recording a brand new episode of Looking at Lucasfilm later this week. Lots of news coming over from that side of the fence, including, did you see they're doing a documentary on John Williams? I want to say it's going to start running on November 6th. But it's called Music by John Williams. Let's see. Also, need to remind you of Disney Unpacked, which is Mr. Testa and I's project that we're doing with veteran Imagineer Jim Schul. It's a video series that's supported by a suite of podcasts. And just today, Sunday, October 6th, we published the latest show over there on Disney Impact, and it's about what happened at Disney's Hollywood Studios when the Power Rangers were doing meet and greets out on the streets of America, which is something of a sequel to last week's Disney Impact show, which then shined a spotlight on the early 1990s at that theme park, which was when the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were doing the same sort of thing, only at that time, this part of that theme park was called New York Street rather than Streets of America. Anyway, as we close up shop here, I want to thank Eric Hersey and David Gray for producing this podcast. Also, folks, please do Drew and I a favor. Head on over to Apple Podcasts and rate and review, well, not just the show you're listening to right now, Fine Tooning, but also Light the Fuse. Beyond that, also need to mention social media. If you're looking for Drew, uses your search term Drew Tailored, like a tailored shirt. As for me, you can find me on Twitter, X, whatever you're calling it, and Instagram as Jim Hill Media, and over on Facebook as Jim Hill Media News. Now, I guess, again, on behalf of Mr. Taylor, who, again, I swear, will be back for next week's show. I promise. Thanks for listening to this week's Fine Tuning, and we will be back soon.